Hello everyone. We're in the 20th century part of our history survey now, and today we'll be looking at World War I and World War II. As we saw in the American Revolution, there was a tree that was critical to the outcome of the conflict, and that was the eastern white pine that was used for ship masts. Well, in World War I, there was also a tree species that was very important, and in this case it was important for building airplanes, and here in front of you you see a little World War I airplane. Airplanes were of course a very new technology at the time. So what kind of tree do you suppose was most important for producing airplanes in World War I, and where did it grow? The answer is the Sitka spruce, which grew in forests of the Northwest. So here's a picture of a massive tree trunk, and you can see the range of the tree along the Pacific coast on the left there. So as you recommended reading for today, I've given you pages from Rutgow's book, American Canopy, where he talks about how the Sitka spruce were successfully harvested to help win World War I. And he likes to tell his stories through the eyes of particular individuals, in this case Bryce Disk. So who was Bryce Disk, and why did General Pershing want to send Disk to the Pacific Northwest? So here's a picture of Disk at his desk. In 1917, he was a retired Army captain, 38 years old. General Pershing realized that spruce wood was critical to the war effort, and he wanted Disk to carry out a secret mission to keep an eye on the wood that was being harvested in the forests. Now, Disk was a soldier and not a forester, and his dream for himself was actually to enlist and serve overseas, but he eventually agreed to Pershing's request to oversee the Pacific Northwest logging situation as a civilian to ensure that the country would have all of the Sitka spruce that it needed to build airplanes. Now, the problem in the Pacific Northwest was labor unrest, and that's why Pershing wanted someone from the military out there to keep an eye on that. There was a radical union called Industrial Workers of the World, which was organizing young, dissatisfied loggers called wobblies to resist the higher-ups such as mill owners, foremen, and managers. The workers wanted better camp conditions and an 8-hour day. Conflicts between the union and lumber authorities were causing violence, instability, and labor conflicts that seriously decreased lumber production. In 1917, in response to the deteriorating labor situation, Disk created a division of the Army called the Spruce Production Division, or the SPD. And these were several thousand enlisted men, ideally recruited with logging experience, who could help to supplement the tumultuous labor pool. And in a worst-case scenario, these soldiers, armed with rifles as well as axes, could intervene to suppress the wobblies. Another organization that Disk got off the ground was called the 4L. Now, how was the 4L different from a straight-out labor union? 4L stood for Legion of Loyal Loggers and Lumbermen. And the idea was to bring all the interested groups in these conflicts, the lumbermen, wobblies, unaffiliated workers, and Spruce Production Division soldiers, into a single body built around the idea of patriotism. And this idea turned out to be very popular. Lots of people signed up on all levels for the 4L. And it was kind of like a union, but not exactly. The workers gave up certain union rights, like the right to strike, but in exchange, conditions in their camps improved, and they were eventually given the 8-hour day that they were asking for. And here's an old picture of some workers working on a tree. As we've seen with these old photographs before, obviously this is really difficult work, and in some cases dangerous also. And here's a picture of a camp and a lot of men standing to have their picture taken. So what were the peak years of production for Disk's operations to put out the Sitka spruce wood? The peak years for production at Disk's mill were 1917 and 1918. In late 1917, he built his own mill to produce massive quantities of airplane-grade spruce close to the forests, and he had the men of the 4L build new railroads for transportation. And in Rutgow's words, this remarkable turnaround staved off an Allied air power crisis. So again, this is the angle of environmental history that revisits a war that we studied a lot in history classes, but not necessarily from the perspective of trees. So we're seeing here the importance of the logging industry, the importance of a particular tree species that's by far the best species to make certain planes, and how they produced a lot of that in a hurry, and that helped to bring the war to an end. I mean, one factor, of course, among others. So armistice, November 11th, 1918, and at that point, the mill wasn't needed for the war anymore. So in World War I, wood was used for a lot of other reasons besides just airplanes. Can you think of what some of those might be? Okay, so here's a list. Training facilities for troops, temporary shelters, wooden containers and crates, wood fires for heat, rifles. Over in Europe, bridges, rail ties, telegraph poles, buildings, and the trench system. I'm sure you've heard of trench warfare in World War I, these very deep dugout trenches where the men would be sort of below the ground, and some of these at least were lined with wood or had sort of wood flooring to help keep it from being too muddy. Some were more elaborately built than others, but there's a picture of one. In 1917, American foresters actually headed to France to help harvest French timber. After the war, a famous poem by the poet Joyce Kilmer was used to help fund memorials for fallen soldiers. The American Forestry Association advocated for planting memorial trees in memory of fallen soldiers. In the words of President Warren G. Harding, I find myself altogether responsive to the AFA's request for an appeal to the people to plant memorial trees. I can hardly think of a more fitting testimonial of our gratitude and affection than this. It would be not only the testimony of our sentiments, but a means to beautify the country which these heroes have so well served. And in addition to planting the trees as part of the publicity campaign to honor the fallen soldiers, they used the poem Trees by the fallen soldier Joyce Kilmer. Now, last year, I was astonished to find that almost none of my students had heard of this poem. School children were raised for a long time memorizing this. I certainly learned it when I was a kid. I've always known this poem. I can't remember when I didn't know it. I think if you talk to your parents and grandparents, they'll probably tell you that they know this poem, at least some of them. So I'm going to read this out loud because it's definitely a part of American history. I think that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree whose hungry mouth is pressed against the earth's sweet flowing breast, a tree that looks to God all day and leaves her leafy arms to pray, a tree that may in summer wear a nest of robins in her hair, upon whose bosom snow has lain, who intimately lives with rain. Poems are made by fools like me, but only God can make a tree. And some of you may have been or may eventually go to the Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest. It's a beautiful old growth forest that's in the general direction of Asheville. I definitely recommend that for a visit. And they named it after the poet of the Trees poem, and there's a little plaque in his honor. Okay, so now we're going to jump ahead, skipping over a few years to get to the Great Depression, which is another important moment in environmental history, the history of trees. So in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, became president. He was very pro-forest. He was influenced by Gifford Pinchot, the man who had first brought scientific forestry to the United States, the one who studied in France and began his career at the Biltmore. So influenced by Pinchot, Roosevelt planted massive number of trees on his own estate. For many years, he actually listed his profession as tree grower, even though he was a politician, and he advocated for trees nationwide. In 1933, during the Great Depression, FDR initiated the famous Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. And one goal of this was to have the unemployed plant trees during the Depression and put them to work that way. It involved 250,000 unemployed young men, and most of the money that they earned was sent to their families. They worked on simple projects, but they also received some education along the way. And this is a part of the general group of projects during the Depression that was called the New Deal. And here's a picture of Roosevelt's so-called tree army. So here's a song that's not too well known, but it's actually by a very famous composer, Aaron Copland, an American composer who lived from 1900 to 1990. This is just a tiny little choral work related to CCC tree planting called What Do We Plant? It's from 1935. Again, it's not a famous work by him at all, but I think it's really interesting that such a famous composer wrote this little song in honor of planting trees. And if you want to follow this link to listen to it, there's a little amateur choir performance that's kind of endearing. So what do we plant when we plant the tree? We plant the ship which will cross the sea. We plant the mast to carry the sails. We plant the planks to withstand the gales, the keelson, the beam, the knee. We plant the ship when we plant the tree. What do we plant when we plant the tree? We plant the houses for you and me. We plant the rafters, the shingles, the floors. We plant the studding, the lath, the doors, the beams and siding, all parts that be. We plant the house when we plant the tree. What do we plant when we plant the tree? 1,000 things that we daily see. We plant the spire that outtowers the crag. We plant the staff for our country's flag. We plant the shade from the hot sun free. We plant all these when we plant the tree. So the CCC had a huge impact while it existed. Over about 1 decade, it employed 2.5 million men, planted over 3 billion trees, and that was roughly 25 trees for every person then living in the country. And they did work on trails, campgrounds, and more. When you're out sometimes in the forest, you can still see things that they've done. You may be walking on a trail that they put into place. You might be walking by one of these trees that they planted. The legacy definitely lives on today. The CCC basically ended as World War II was coming up. The young men were now needed for war industries and the military. By the time World War II began, technologies had changed, and for example, airplanes were now using much more metal in their construction and not as much wood, although I think some was still used for airplanes, but not nearly as much as in World War I. Wood was still needed though for housing, weapons, fuel containers, and more, so it was important. And during World War II, a huge concern grew over the possibility of forest fires, specifically out on the West Coast, a theme that we keep coming back to in this class over and over again. So the government was worried that any big forest fire in the West would divert resources from the war. So the government began a campaign urging Americans to be very careful with fire when camping and so forth. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but in 1944, the Japanese tried to start fires on the West Coast with high-altitude fire balloons. Most of these failed completely, but one of the balloons that detonated late did end up killing 6 people in an Oregon forest. Now, this is something that you might not have heard of before, but it's fascinating. The movie Bambi came out in 1942 as Disney's 5th full-length animated film, and this was during the Second World War that it came out. The theme of Bambi is conflicts between animals and human hunters. Bambi's mother is killed by a hunter, and then later in the film, all of the animals flee a forest fire accidentally lit by other hunters. So it was just a coincidence that this big forest fire scene in Bambi appeared right when the US government wanted to have a campaign to prevent forest fires on the West Coast. So they went to Disney, and Disney agreed to loan Bambi to the government as a publicity, sort of a mascot for 1 year for their anti-fire campaign, but not for more than 1 year. And here's a poster from the time. You see Bambi with Bambi's little friends. Please, mister, don't be careless. Prevent forest fires, greater danger than ever. And if you want to see the actual scene, which is quite famous, there's the link to it, and there's other links that will also take you if you just type in Bambi forest fire scene. It's very dramatic. After using Bambi for just 1 year, the government then needed a new animal mascot for its anti-fire campaign. And this is how Smokey Bear was born. In 1944, Smokey Bear replaced Bambi in the government campaign against forest fire. there's a little poster. Smokey says, "Care will prevent 9 out of 10 forest fires." So Smokey has been a national mascot ever since, and I'm not going to require this for the online students, but I strongly recommend following this link to this Washington Post article. In fact, I'll put it up on As You Learn. And the question of the article is, was Smokey Bear wrong? How a beloved character may have helped to fuel catastrophic fires. So the question is, was this fire prevention campaign that largely dates from World War II partly responsible for the fact that natural fires got prevented too much, excess debris, a heavier fuel load built up on the forest floor, and is it perhaps the case that that's helping to fuel some of the massive fires that we're seeing today, of course also augmented greatly by the effect of climate change. And the Little Washington Post article also has some great videos, kind of historic videos of different Smokey Bear advertisements throughout the years, all the way from the beginning into the present. So if you want to learn a little bit more about Smokey and watch some kind of fun stuff, I recommend that link there. So here are the references, and again, a lot of this general information came from Eric Rothgau's book, American Canopy, and I strongly recommend reading that book if you're interested in learning more.